Please join me in the prayer for illumination. God of all life, quiet our souls and open our hearts, that by your Holy Spirit we may not only hear your words to us this day, but believe it, and in believing be assured of all that is so possible with us and through us by the power of your amazing grace. In Jesus' name, amen. A reading from the Hebrew Scriptures. Hear the word of the Lord. The Lord God took the human and settled him in the Garden of Eden to farm it and take care of it. The Lord God commanded the human, eat your fill from all the garden's trees, but don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because on that day you eat from it, you will die. The snake was the most intelligent of all the wild animals that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, did God really say you shouldn't eat from any tree in the garden? The woman said to the snake, we may eat the fruit from the garden's trees, but not the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden. God said, don't eat from it and don't touch it, or you will die. The snake said to the woman, you won't die. God knows that on the day you eat from it, then you will see clearly, that you will be like God, knowing good and evil. The woman saw that the tree was beautiful, with delicious fruit, and that the tree would provide wisdom. So she took some of its fruit and ate it, and also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate it. And they both saw clearly and knew that they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made garments for themselves. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Praise chapter, beginning with the first verse. Listen to what the Spirit is saying to the community of faith this day. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But Jesus answered, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, He will command the angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone." Jesus said to him, "Again it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again the devil took him to a very high mountain, and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And he said to him, "All these I will give to you, if you will fall down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him." Then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Psychomachia. Psychomachia. And no, this is not the name of my professional wrestling villain alter ego, which, in case you were wondering, is actually the sinister minister. But a word that I didn't even know existed prior to this past week. Do you remember when you were younger and you would wake up on Saturday mornings and watch cartoons until a parent would tell you to get dressed and either do your chores or go outside and play? So you went outside and played. Do you remember how in like Tom and Jerry cartoons, there would be that one or more where Tom had Jerry trapped and was faced with the moral and ethical dilemma of Jerry's ultimate fate, and suddenly a much smaller Tom in a white robe with wings and a halo and maybe a harp would suddenly appear on one of his shoulders and tell him to let poor Jerry go. And then just as suddenly there would appear over on his other shoulder another tiny Tom, this time all dressed in red with horns and a pitchfork, who would tell him not to listen to that first angelic Tom and to just go ahead and finish Jerry off. Do you remember those? If not, it was Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck, or Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, which comes to think of it begs the question, what does Hollywood have against animated ducks? That they're always the nemesis or sidekick and never the lead or hero. I smell a Ronan Farrow expose in there somewhere. Anyway, it has been a common trope, the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other, on television and in film for decades. Whatever the unique circumstances, a character will be faced with some sort of conflict of the soul that somehow conjures up in their psyche these competing drives that reside within us all. The desire to do the right thing and the temptation to do the opposite. So I went to the internet to look for, to Google, examples, illustrations of some of the more famous instances of this creative device, and that's when I found it. Psychomachia. It actually has a name. Who knew? I had assumed it was something that began around 100 years ago with the advent of film and then television, but I was wrong. Way back in the early 5th century, the Roman poet Prudentius, who strangely enough also invented insurance, no he didn't, wrote a little medieval allegory where the two spiritual adversaries battle it out for the soul of the main character. The psychomachia, as it is called, was intended to persuade the reader or listener to turn away from pagan idolatry to Christianity. In ancient manuscripts, some of which have survived, there are illustrations that actually show the angel and the tempter battling it out on opposing shoulders of the ethically challenged hero. which at least in one copy looks an awful lot like a duck. No, it doesn't. But whatever the useless history lesson, when I visualize temptation, this is how I imagine it. In this morning's passage, the same biblical story that marks every first Sunday in Lent, some 500 years even before Prudentius, we are presented with this apparently universal element of the human condition, temptation. In this case, and potentially in all cases, the temptation to stray from the way of life that God desires for us. What's interesting to me about temptation, and the devil in particular, at least in their literary form, is how often we imagine the moral dilemma to be one that is clearly between good and evil, where the temptation is to kill or betray or cheat or lie or some other horrible Ten Commandment breaking offense. But whether it is Adam and Eve in the garden or Jesus in the wilderness, or us in our 21st century first world circumstances, the temptation is and has always been the same. The temptation to be just like God, knowing good and evil. The temptation of power and privilege and even immortality. We are tempted not toward those things that are dark and horrific, but toward those things that, by all appearances, are bright and shiny, that capture all of our attention and energy, keep us chasing after that which will always be inevitably out of our reach. And why? These things, money, status, stuff, comfort, security, aren't inherently evil, bad, destructive, whatever word or concept works for you. But they are, as is just about anything, if they keep us from seeing the suffering of our brothers and sisters. In which case, the greatest temptation isn't to commit a crime, to break a commandment, and it isn't to be rich and powerful and popular. The greatest temptation is to no longer care for and about one another, especially the most marginalized and vulnerable among us. The greatest temptation is apathy. And sometimes when I look at my own life and I look at the world, I can't help but wonder if the tempter is winning. The voice of contemporary temptation doesn't tell us to go turn stones into bread or throw ourselves off the highest building or offer us power and authority or even to go and eat a piece of fruit. No, it tells us that we are too busy to make even the smallest effort to alleviate the suffering of the other members of the human family, our brothers and sisters, that we are too tired, that we are not enough, that it is somebody else's job, that it's not our problem, that the suffering, the injustice present in the world is too overwhelming, and so we become apathetic to the struggles and sufferings around us. Apathy comes from a Greek word, apatheia, which is made up of two words, a, meaning without, and pathos, meaning suffering. Apathy is a spiritual disease that renders us incapable of empathy. In an article, Jesus and the Way of Compassion, Mark Van Steenwyk, the executive director of the Center for Prophetic Imagination right here in Minneapolis, writes, "Our entire society reinforces apathy by hiding every uncomfortable truth behind the facade of middle-class acceptability. We get oil without seeing a glimpse of the deaths on foreign soil that purchased the oil. Our consumer goods come to us ready-formed without us understanding the ways those who made these goods were exploited. We are cut off from much suffering and instead turn to comforts to numb what suffering is able to pierce our consciousness. But Jesus rejects apathy. His is a way of compassion. The way of compassion. This is going to be our focus during the season of Lent on Sunday mornings. Compassion comes from the Latin word that means to suffer with. Compassion rejects apathy and isolation and bridges the distance between persons by challenging us to actually enter into the lives of those who are suffering, meeting them where they are, listening to their struggles, comforting them in their pain, and working to change the circumstances that are the foundation of their suffering so that future generations may never have to share their experience. Compassion is easily understood in our society as sentiment, as an emotional feeling. Perhaps this is because our society has so thoroughly inherited the separation of action from intention that we feel sentiment is all that is required to be a loving human being. But in Jesus, there is no separation between intention and action. His action reflects his heart, just as his life reflects the very life of God. Rather than a weak feeling or a condescending act of charity, compassion is active. Compassion is prophetic. Those with compassion refuse to accept the world as it is and enter into injustice and brokenness. Compassion collapses the distance between us and them. And in bridging that distance, compassion exposes the temptations that breed fear and alienation, isolation and separation. In his classic work, The Prophetic Imagination, Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann put it this way: compassion constitutes a radical form of criticism, for it announces that the hurt is to be taken seriously, that the hurt is not to be accepted as normal and natural, but is an abnormal and unacceptable condition for humanness. Thus, the compassion of Jesus is to be understood not simply as a personal emotional reaction, but as a public criticism in which he dares to act upon his concern against the entire numbness of his social context. Jesus penetrates the numbness by his compassion, and with his compassion takes the first step by making visible the odd abnormality that has become business as usual. Thus, compassion that might be seen simply as generous goodwill is in fact criticism of the system, forces, and ideologies that produce that hurt. Jesus enters into the hurt and finally comes to embody it. The way of Jesus is the way of compassion. It involves sharing life with those around us and suffering with them. Over the next 6 weeks, I want to challenge us all to reject apathy and embrace an active and prophetic way of compassion. Whatever it is that might be tempting you away from the suffering around us, the suffering of your neighbor, the suffering of those you know and love, and the suffering of those who are otherwise invisible to you, the suffering of those who live on the other side of the world, or in worlds right in your own backyard or around the corner from you, but that you manage to keep at a vast distance. Whatever the tempter's voice is telling you, that there is nothing you can do, that it is all too much, and that there is nothing special about you, that you are too small, too unimportant, too busy, too tired. Whatever the vices we use to help us numb and ignore and pretend away the struggles of our brothers and sisters, let us turn away from them all and instead do the very thing we fear, the scary, the difficult, the uncomfortable, the challenging work of actual compassion, suffering with one another, bridging the distance between us and them. Let us move beyond having compassion or feeling compassion to acting compassionately, to being compassionate, listening to our better angels to care for the marginalized and the most vulnerable, the ignored, the silent, and the forgotten among us, our brothers and sisters. This is the way of Jesus. This is the way of the cross. And this is the way we are called to follow as his disciples and God's beloved children. Be compassionate. Be compassionate. And to God alone be all the glory. Amen.